He thought he was just hiring a woman to cook meals for his 4 children. But the widow who stepped through his door didn't just fill their plates, she filled their hearts. And what unfolded behind that weathered garden gate wasn't just a second chance. It was a miracle waiting to bloom. Before we begin this unforgettable journey of love healing and quiet courage, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for stories that touch the soul and remind us what truly matters. Now let me take you to the garden behind the house. The wind scraped across the dry earth like an old man clearing his throat. Dust swirled along the fence posts lining the road to Miles Thatcher's house, once white, now faded to the color of old parchment. The late afternoon sun burned down on the tin roof, casting long, lean shadows that spilled across the porch and into the empty garden behind the house. It used to be something, that garden. Lavender bushes humming with bees, fat red tomatoes dangling from dark green vines. A wooden bench where his wife Maggie would sit with Millie, curled on her lap, and a basket of strawberries between them. But now the bench was grayed and splintered. The vines had withered. The garden was nothing but a field of cracked soil and thorny weeds that scratched at the wind like it owed them something. Miles leaned against the porch post, one boot crossed over the other, watching his 4 children through the screen door as they pushed cold spaghetti around their plates. Dinner had become a routine of low expectations. Ruby, 9, tried to convince Caleb to eat something green. Bo, the oldest at 11, had gone quiet again, staring at the wall like it might say something if he waited long enough. And Millie, barely 4, just held her plastic fork without lifting it. He sighed, pulled a folded piece of paper from his back pocket, and smoothed it against the doorframe. Wanted someone to help cook and care for 4 children. No experience needed. Just bring a kind heart. Apply in person at the Thatcher house. 3rd property west of old Miller's barn. He stared at the words. They looked pathetic even to him, but what else could he say? He didn't need a professional. He needed someone who wouldn't flinch when Bo said nothing, when Ruby cried over crayons, when Millie refused to speak, or when Caleb spilled more milk than he drank. He needed someone who knew what it was like to hurt quietly. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, he walked the long road to Miller's barn and pinned the paper on the weathered board beside the gas pump. He didn't wait for hope. He just wanted to be able to say he'd tried. The next morning brought no sign of change. The sun beat down with a dry vengeance, and by 10, Miles had already removed his shirt and slung it over his shoulder, sweat darkening the collar of his undershirt. He was oiling the hinges on the barn door when he heard footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, not someone selling soap or religion. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag. A woman stood at the gate, early 30s maybe. Worn jeans, white blouse tucked into a faded belt. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed her face, but not her voice when she finally spoke. "I saw your note." Miles blinked. "You're early." She gave a soft half-smile. "Just passing through town. Thought I'd stop." He looked her over. She carried no suitcase, no resume, just a cloth tote hanging from one shoulder, and what looked like dirt under her fingernails. "You ever cared for kids before I've taught them? Cooked for them?" "Raised one of my own," she said, a shadow flickering in her eyes. "You a teacher used to be. Cooking instructor mostly. And now, I need a quiet place. Maybe somewhere I can put these." She pulled out a small packet from her tote seeds, he realized. He couldn't see the label. She added, "If it's all right with you, I'd like to start in the garden." He tilted his head. "Garden's dead." "Not always," she said. "Nothing's dead until it stops trying." Something in him tugged at that. He opened the gate. "I'm Miles." "Elena," she replied, stepping through. By noon, she had kicked off her shoes and rolled up her sleeves. The kids hovered near the windows, watching a stranger kneel into their mother's ghost. Elena ran her hands over the soil like she was reading Braille, whispering something under her breath. Ruby was the first to venture out. "You know anything about lavender?" she asked, half defiant. Elena glanced up and smiled. "Know it so well. I used to talk to mine." "Did it talk back?" "Only when I listened real close." Ruby grinned despite herself. Inside, Miles brewed coffee and watched them from the porch. The woman had stirred something first in the dirt, then in the kids. He didn't trust it yet. But there was a stillness in her presence, like standing near water, that hadn't moved in years and suddenly rippled. Familiar, but unexplainable. When Bo came out and silently handed Elena a trowel, Miles's grip on the mug tightened. That boy hadn't volunteered a single gesture in weeks. Later that evening, Elena stood in the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I can make dinner tomorrow," she offered. "Something warm, from scratch." Miles nodded. "You plan on staying?" She hesitated. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether this house needs me, or just someone." His eyes met hers. They didn't blink, didn't soften. But he said, "This house needs a lot of things, but kindness might be a good start." She nodded, setting the towel down. "Then I'll come back tomorrow, and I'll bring Rosemary." As she walked out the garden behind the house, caught the last light of the day, and for the first time in 3 years, it didn't look completely dead. The morning sun peeled slowly over the horizon, bleeding soft gold across the wooden floorboards of the kitchen. Miles sat at the table, elbows on knees, cradling a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The house was still too still. Even the usual creaks and groans of an aging farmhouse seemed to hold their breath. He'd been up since before dawn, listening to the wind shift through the broken slats of the fence and the restless sighs of a home that had forgotten how to feel alive. Outside, Bo and Caleb chased a chicken that had somehow slipped the coop, while Ruby sat cross-legged on the porch with a drawing pad sketching clouds. Millie clung to a ragged teddy bear in silence, her eyes darting to the front gate more than once. "She's not coming," Bo had muttered when Miles passed through the living room earlier. People always say things and don't come back. But Miles wasn't so sure. At exactly 9:07, Elena returned. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked through the side gate with a canvas tote in one hand and a wicker basket of herbs in the other, as if she belonged there, which in some strange, not yet explained way she did. Ruby was the first to see her. "She brought Rosemary," she said, trying to sound unimpressed, but her voice carried a hope she couldn't disguise. Elena moved with quiet purpose. She tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, and got to work clearing the garden's edge. Miles watched from the porch, pretending to fix the latch on the screen door, while really just observing the way her hands worked, slow, deliberate, like someone who'd learned to savor movement after loss. She didn't try to entertain the kids, didn't talk down to them. She simply worked, and by doing so, invited them into her stillness. It was Bo, surprisingly, who joined her first. He picked up a rake and started pulling weeds like he'd done it 1,000 times, though he hadn't touched that garden since the funeral. Then Ruby came. Then Caleb. And finally, Millie wandered outside and sat beside a patch of basil like she was waiting for something to grow before her eyes. Later that morning, Elena came into the kitchen with dirt-streaked hands and a flushed face. "I was thinking something simple for lunch," she said. "Maybe roasted potatoes and eggs with rosemary, if I can borrow the stove." Miles arched a brow. "That thing's older than I am." She smiled. "So long as it doesn't explode, I think I can manage." He nodded. "Use anything you find." It was strange watching someone else move around the kitchen, The space had gone untouched for so long that it felt like walking into a frozen museum. Elena opened drawers with confidence, moved like she belonged, and somehow didn't disturb the silence, she just softened it. The scent of rosemary and sizzling potatoes began to drift through the house. The children gathered at the table as if drawn by instinct. Millie, to everyone's shock, climbed into her chair without a word of protest. Elena placed a steaming dish in front of them and sat down without ceremony. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't the old, heavy kind of silence. It was something gentler, warmer, like the hush that comes over a church pew before someone starts to sing. After lunch, Elna stood by the kitchen window drying her hands with a tea towel. Miles leaned against the doorframe. "You really know what you're doing? With lunch or with the kids?" "Both," he said, then hesitated. "You said you raised one of your own." She nodded, her smile faltering. "A little girl. Ellie." The name hit him like the echo of a bell in a quiet canyon. Elena didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. But something in her voice, the way it dimmed just slightly then steadied, told him that name had been packed away for a long time. "Was she?" he started, then stopped. Elena folded the towel neatly and placed it on the counter. "She was sunshine," she said softly. "Gone too fast. Like all good things." Miles didn't respond. He just stood there, the weight of his own memories filling the space between them. That evening, as the light bled red-orange across the horizon, Elena walked out to the porch, where Miles sat with his boots, propped on the railing, a glass of sweet tea in hand. "She's quiet. Your youngest," Elena said, sitting in the rocking chair beside him. "She hasn't spoken much since the accident," he replied. "Not to anyone." "She will," Elena said, "but not because someone asks her to. It'll be because someone makes her feel safe again." Miles looked at her for a long moment. "You talk like you've been through the war." She smiled, not bitterly, but with a tired kind of grace. "Grief is a war, just slower. And it never tells you when it's over." The stars came out one by one as the porch light flickered above them. The crickets began their nighttime hymn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "I'm not here for charity," Elena said suddenly. "I came because I needed somewhere to land, just for a while." Miles didn't reply right away. Then he said, "Well, the roof leaks and the stove's ancient, but there's plenty of land. And maybe we all need to land somewhere." She looked out at the garden, barely touched, but finally breathing. "I'll bring lavender next," she said. "And thyme. Maybe some hope, too." The wind shifted that morning softer than usual, carrying with it the faintest trace of moisture. The sky over the Thatcher house wasn't quite gray, but something in the air whispered of change, like a promise made just beneath the breath of the wind. Miles noticed it first, while standing at the fence, coffee mug warm in his hand. The horizon shimmered differently. He squinted. For 3 years, the land had been dry as bone. Even the weeds had stopped trying. But now, maybe. Out back, Elena was already in the garden, her wide-brimmed hat tilted just enough to shade her eyes. Her hands were buried in soil, tenderly coaxing life from earth that had forgotten it could bloom. She didn't speak to the children unless they spoke first. It wasn't a strategy, it was instinct. And somehow it worked. Bo raked the corner where the pumpkin seeds had gone in the day before. Ruby carefully pressed marigold seeds into small holes Elena had helped her mark with twigs. Caleb was mostly just trying to keep the dog from digging it all up. And Millie sat quietly on a blanket Elena had spread near the sage, holding a small watering can in both hands, even though it was empty. Elena glanced up at the girl every now and then, but didn't disturb her stillness. Sometimes presence said more than words ever could. Mid-morning brought the scent of rosemary and heat. Miles fixed the porch screen again, though it didn't really need fixing. He just liked being close enough to hear their voices float back from the garden. Something about their rhythm, the soft murmur of Elena's voice mixing with Ruby's laughter, made the house feel less hollow. He watched Millie stare at the sky lips parted. She lifted her hand slowly, like trying to catch something invisible. Elena, she called not loudly, but clear enough to freeze everyone in place. It was the first word she'd spoken in almost a year. Time stopped. Even the wind seemed to hush. Elena turned, hands still dusted with dirt, and met the girl's eyes without surprise. "Yes, sweetheart." Millie pointed upward. A single drop of rain landed on her finger, then another on her nose. The sky cracked open just enough and let down a soft, misty rain. The kids stood motionless, at first unsure if they should run inside. But Elena stayed where she was, tilted her head back, and closed her eyes as the rain began to fall slow and gentle like forgiveness. Then Bo laughed. It started small like a hiccup, then turned into a real belly-deep laugh as the drops soaked through his shirt. Caleb whooped and ran in circles. Ruby spun like a ballerina, her arms wide. And Millie. She just smiled, wide, unguarded, radiant. Miles had forgotten how beautiful her smile could be. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain soak through his flannel. It had been so long since he'd felt anything but dry wind and dust. This softness felt like something holy. Elena turned toward him, hair damp, eyes shining. "Hope's always quieter than thunder," she said. "But it's just as powerful." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. They spent the rest of the morning dripping wet and entirely unconcerned. Elena brought out towels. Miles dug out mugs for hot cocoa. The kids changed into dry clothes and curled up on the rug, while Elena reheated leftover potato stew. Millie stayed close to her side, small fingers grasping the edge of Elena's skirt without speaking a word. But she didn't have to. Her presence said everything. That afternoon, the garden drank deeply, and so did the hearts inside the house. Miles found himself in the old pantry searching for something he hadn't touched since Maggie died, a wooden box of seeds she had labeled by hand. He wiped off the dust, then carried it outside. Elena looked up from where she was planting mint. He held the box out to her. These were Maggie's. Elena took it gently, reverently. "You sure you want me to?" "She'd want someone to use them," Miles said. "I think she'd like you." There was a long pause. "I think she would too," Elena replied, and for the first time Miles felt like maybe letting go of the past didn't mean he had to lose it entirely. That evening, as the sun broke through the clouds for a final golden breath, Elena stood on the back steps, with Miles watching the children chase one another between damp rows of earth. "You did something today," he said quietly. She looked at him. "What's that?" "You made," Millie smiled. Elena shook her head. "I didn't do anything. The rain did." Miles looked out over the field. "No. You gave her a reason to wait for it." They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then, almost without thinking, Miles asked, "You planning on staying a while?" Elena turned to him, searching his face. "I haven't planned anything in a long time," she said. "But this feels like somewhere I could belong." The truth settled between them, not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. And just beyond them, the garden behind the house, once dead, once a silent, glowed faintly under the new green of its first leaves. The rain left behind the kind of quiet that made you pay attention. It wasn't the oppressive silence that used to fill the house, the kind that made every creaking floorboard sound like a cry. No, this quiet was gentler, like the world had exhaled and was waiting for something beautiful to grow. Miles stood in the kitchen early that morning, pouring coffee with one hand while holding a faded photo in the other. Maggie barefoot in the garden, holding Millie like a watering can, both of them soaked in sunshine. He hadn't looked at that picture in over a year. Now it didn't hurt quite as sharply. In the next room, he heard Caleb and Bo arguing over who got to feed the chickens, and Ruby calling out for her missing sock. Normal things. Things that used to feel impossible. And then through the rattle of mourning voices came a sound that stopped him cold. Laughter. Soft. Feminine. Elena. She was in the pantry, sleeves rolled hair in a loose braid. Millie clung to the hem of her blouse, watching intently as Elena pulled down spice jars and murmured names like they were treasures. Thyme, cumin, bay leaf. "I've got something special planned for supper," she told the children. "What is it?" Ruby asked. "A soup my grandmother used to make when I was little. But I need one thing." She turned to Millie. "Will you help me find it?" Millie nodded, eyes wide. Elena led her to the drawer under the oven, the one Maggie used to keep her aprons. Miles instinctively stiffened. That drawer had remained unopened since the funeral. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words died on his tongue. Millie reached in first. There were only 2 aprons inside, both folded carefully. One was white with tiny blue flowers. The other, a soft pink, with a small embroidered heart near the pocket. "That's the one," Elena whispered. She took it gently, pressing it to her chest like it was made of glass. Her eyes welled just for a moment before she swallowed hard and tied it around her waist. Miles stepped back unnoticed. She cooked with a kind of quiet reverence that day. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and roasted tomatoes, rosemary, and onion. She moved like someone performing a ceremony, precise, but full of soul. Miles watched from the doorway. The apron, once Maggie's, looked almost natural on Elena. But it wasn't just the cloth. It was the way she stood in the room, unafraid of its ghosts. Somehow, she didn't erase Maggie's presence. She honored it. He wanted to say something. Anything. But he didn't know how. That afternoon, while the stew simmered, Elena sat on the porch with Millie curled in her lap, Ruby braiding wildflowers into her hair, and Bo carving a piece of wood nearby. Caleb was still inside, licking the spoon he'd stolen from the pot. Miles stepped out with 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Elena without a word. She took it with a soft smile. "You don't mind," she said quietly, "that I used her apron." He hesitated. "I did." At first he admitted. "But not because of you. Just because I didn't think anyone ever could again." She nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I know that feeling. I have a box in my closet I haven't touched in years. It has Ellie's blanket, her favorite storybook, a stuffed dog with one eye." Her voice cracked but didn't break. "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Couldn't give it away either. So it just sits there like a little museum of what I lost." Miles stared into his tea. "I used to think moving on meant leaving Maggie behind, so I didn't move. I just froze." Elena looked at him, eyes soft. "Maybe we don't have to leave them behind. Maybe we carry them with us like seeds." He glanced at her, and for the first time in years, something inside him shifted. Not just grief or guilt. Something warmer. Something daring to grow. Dinner that evening was the kind that wrapped around your bones and made you feel safe. The children devoured the soup bread crumbs sticking to their cheeks. Ruby declared it tasted like Sunday. Caleb asked if they could have it every week. Even Bo, reserved as always, gave a nod of approval. Millie leaned her head on Elena's shoulder and whispered something into her ear. Elena smiled and said only, "Yes, sweetie. Maybe tomorrow?" Miles didn't ask what she said. He didn't need to. After the children went to bed, Miles stepped onto the porch again. Elena joined him a few minutes later, still wearing the pink apron. He handed her a folded towel. "You can keep it," he said. "The apron." Elena held it gently. "I wasn't sure if it would be too much." "It is," he said. "But somehow, That's what makes it right. They stood in silence, listening to the frogs near the creek and the soft rustle of wind through the sagebrush. The world felt open, wide, and waiting. Miles turned to her. "I don't know what this is yet," he said honestly, "but it doesn't feel like something I want to lose." Elena looked up at him, eyes shining, voice steady. "Then let's not rush it. Let's just plant it and see if it grows." And behind them, through the open kitchen window, the scent of Maggie's old recipe lingered, now made new by a pair of hands that carried their own story, their own grief, and the courage to begin again. The summer sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long amber shadows across the freshly weeded rows of basil and chives. Fireflies blinked lazily in the twilight, as if testing the night's patience. The air smelled of sagebrush, damp earth, and the lingering sweetness of lavender that had just begun to bloom under Elena's care. Inside the house, the dining table had been pulled closer to the wide porch window. A single lantern hung above, swaying gently from an old ceiling beam. Its warm light bathed the room in a kind of soft gold that made even the mismatched dishes look like they belonged together. Tonight was special. Ruby had helped set the table, placing forks exactly 1 inch from the plate edges, mimicking what she called fancy restaurant style. Bo brought in the chairs from the porch. Caleb had insisted on wearing a button-up shirt, the only one he owned, which had a missing button and a grass stain on the sleeve. And Millie? Millie had asked Elena to braid her hair. Elena stood in the kitchen wearing Maggie's pink apron, her hands deftly stirring a pot of something rich and slow-cooked. Tomato thyme, a hint of lemon zest. She had spent the afternoon teaching Ruby how to knead bread dough, and the scent of warm, crusty loaves now filled the house like a memory come back to life. Miles leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, silently, watching the choreography that had returned to this kitchen movement, with rhythm, purpose, and a kind of joy that didn't ask for attention. It just was. "Dinner's ready," Elena called out. The children filed in, chattering like a small storm. Bo held Millie's hand. Ruby carried the bread like it was a crown jewel. Even Caleb remembered to wash his hands. As they settled into their seats, Elena set the pot of soup in the center of the table. "It's called minestrone della nonna," she said, a little breathless. "It means grandmother's soup in Italian. My nonna made it every Sunday with whatever the garden gave us that week." Caleb wrinkled his nose. "Is there spinach in it?" "Only a little," she grinned. "I'll eat around it." They bowed their heads briefly, not quite praying, but close enough to feel the sacredness of the moment. The first spoonfuls were quiet. Then came the nods, the small sounds of satisfaction. Bread passed hand to hand, butter melted into laughter. "This is better than Dad's spaghetti," Caleb announced, mouthful. I heard that Miles said, feigning offense. "You were supposed to," Caleb smirked. Elena laughed, but it caught in her throat as Millie tugged gently at her sleeve. "Can I call you Ellie?" The room went still. Elena blinked. "Sweetheart." "What do you mean Ellie was your girl, right?" Millie asked. The one who liked soup, Elena's heart squeezed so tightly it hurt. She hadn't spoken Ellie's name aloud in this house, not once. But somehow this tiny girl had felt it, known it. "She was Elena," whispered her voice, trembling. Millie reached out and touched her hand. "Then if I call you Ellie, she won't be gone." "Right." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elena knelt beside her chair, cupping Millie's face gently. "You can call me anything you want," she said, her eyes shining. "But I promise you, this Ellie is here. She's here in every spoonful, every laugh, every time someone shares without being asked." Millie nodded slowly, then leaned forward and kissed Elena on the cheek. It wasn't a word, but it was everything. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the kids tucked into bed, Miles stepped onto the porch where Elena sat sipping tea and watching the lantern swing. "You okay?" he asked. Elena gave a small smile, not quite steady. "I didn't expect her to say that. She's observant." "Always has been," he said. But what she said, she was right. Elena looked at him. "I've spent so long locking Ellie away like a photograph in a drawer. But tonight, I didn't feel guilty when I said her name." Miles leaned on the railing. "You shouldn't feel guilty for living." Elena turned back to the stars. "I know that now. But it's hard to believe you deserve a second chance when the first one was so beautiful and then it was gone." Miles nodded, slow and thoughtful. Maybe the second one doesn't have to replace the first. Maybe it just honors it. She looked at him, really looked, and found no pity, no sadness, just quiet understanding. And that felt like a miracle. They sat in silence for a while, watching the shadows play across the garden. The lantern's light reached just far enough to kiss the first blossoms of lavender soft and pale in the darkness. "I used to think the garden died, with her," Miles said suddenly. "But maybe it just went to sleep." Elena placed her hand gently over his. "Then let's keep waking it up." The summer sun had barely risen when the whispers started. It began as most things did, in a town that hadn't changed in 30 years, with a single voice saying something just loud enough for someone else to carry it. "She's hiding something. I heard she left her last job without notice. They say she owed money, that she left her apartment in the middle of the night. I wouldn't let her near my kids." It only took one afternoon at the feed store for Miles to hear it. He'd stopped in to grab nails and a replacement handle for Caleb's broken shovel. But by the time he reached the counter, he could feel the tension in the air, the sideways glances that lingered too long. Sally Grant, a widow herself and not usually unkind, leaned over and said, "Miles, I'm just looking out for you. Folks don't know where she came from or what she's been through. That kind of woman, sometimes trouble follows her." Miles's jaw tightened. "She's been nothing but kind." Sally nodded slowly, folding her arms. "Sure. That's how it always starts." He paid and left without another word. But the seed had been planted, and despite his best efforts, it began to take root. When he returned home, Elena was baking cornbread with ruby flour dusted across her cheek. The children laughed, genuine, effortless, and for a moment the house felt like home again. But Miles's gaze lingered longer than usual, studied her face too closely, noticed things he hadn't before: a small scar near her wrist, a hesitation when Ruby mentioned school, and he realized with shame that he had never once asked where Elena had come from. He'd been so focused on what she brought to the house that he never wondered what she might be running from. That night he was quiet at dinner, not cold, but cautious. Elena noticed. And when she passed him the cornbread, her hand brushed his, and he pulled back without thinking. She blinked. A flicker of something hurt, maybe, or understanding crossed her face. But she said nothing. The next day, Elena rose early to weed the garden, but her steps were slower. The children asked for pancakes. She made oatmeal. Caleb whined, and for the first time she snapped, not sharply, but enough to silence the room. After breakfast, she disappeared into the garden and stayed there long after the sun had reached its peak. The back of her blouse soaked with sweat, her hands trembling as she dug into the stubborn earth dirt, caking under her nails. Miles watched from the porch, torn between guilt and suspicion. He hated that the two could coexist. By mid-afternoon, Elena came into the kitchen and pulled out her tote bag. She began packing slowly, deliberately. A jar of dried herbs, her grandmother's spoon, the apron. Miles stepped inside, his voice low. "Where are you going?" She didn't look up. "I think you know. I didn't ask you to leave." But you stopped asking me to stay, she said softly. You stopped looking at me like you did that night on the porch. Elena, I've been down this road before, she continued. People see a woman who's alone, and they assume things. People talk. Then they stop trusting. And then they close the door before you can explain. He took a step closer. Then explain. Elena finally looked at him, eyes tired, voice steady. My husband died of cancer 4 years ago. I took time off from the school to care for him. When he passed, I lost the job, the apartment, everything. I tried to rebuild. But Ellie, her voice cracked. Ellie didn't make it. And after she was gone, I stopped showing up. I didn't owe money. I didn't run. I just disappeared. Miles stood in silence. She continued, I came here because I needed air. And you, your kids, you gave me something I didn't think I could feel again. But if you're going to believe a stranger over what we've built here, then I can't stay. A beat passed. Then 2. And then Millie stepped out from behind the doorway, clutching her teddy bear, and whispered, Don't go. Elena turned, her composure breaking. Please don't go, Millie said again, louder this time, her small voice trembling. You're our Ellie. Elena dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Millie ran into them, burying her face in Elena's shoulder. Ruby appeared next, wrapping her arms around them both. Caleb and Bo stood silently uncertain, but unmoving. Miles felt the breath leave his chest. He had seen grief, lived in its shadow, but he had never seen this love holding grief in its hands, refusing to let it fall. That night, he waited on the porch until the stars broke through the clouds. When Elena stepped out, still wiping her cheeks, he stood up. I was wrong, he said quietly, for not asking, for doubting, for listening to people who weren't here to see what you've done. Elena folded her arms, not coldly, but protectively. I'm tired of proving I'm good, she said. I just want to be. Miles nodded. Then be. Here. With us. She searched his face, then stepped closer. And when he reached out to take her hand, she didn't pull away. The morning after Elena chose to stay was impossibly quiet. Not the uneasy hush of doubt, but a peaceful stillness, like the earth itself was pausing to take a breath. The children moved with a calmness unfamiliar to the old house. Bo made the toast. Ruby fed the hens. Caleb, for the first time in memory, poured juice for his siblings, without spilling a drop. And Millie hummed. Not a song, not a melody, just a sound of contentment, soft and steady as she colored at the kitchen table. Elena stood at the sink, sleeves rolled, drying the last of the breakfast dishes. Her hands moved gently, but her eyes drifted often toward the garden, toward the small patch she and Millie had planted together just days before. She hadn't expected to stay, but something in the soil had changed the way her heart beat. This wasn't just shelter. This was becoming something. By midday, the sun blazed overhead. Miles returned from town with a box of nails and a plank of weathered wood under his arm. The children watched as he measured the edge of the back garden, digging post holes and marking lines with chalk. What are you building? Bo finally asked. Miles looked up, squinting against the glare. A new fence, he said. The old one was falling apart. Bo tilted his head. But we never used a fence before. I know, Miles replied. Then glancing toward the house where Elena watched quietly from the kitchen window, he added, but some things are worth protecting. The kids helped him dig one post at a time. Elena made lemonade and watched from the porch the sound of shovels and laughter stitching themselves into the fabric of the day. At one point, Millie came running to her breathless and flushed, holding a broken robin's egg. It fell from the tree, she said sadly. Elena knelt. Sometimes things break before they get the chance to fly. Is that what happened to Ellie? Millie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena's heart paused. Then she nodded gently. But sometimes, she said, they leave behind pieces that remind us how beautiful they were. And we carry those. Millie turned the shell over in her small hand. Can I plant it? Elena smiled, tears welling. Yes. Right by the mint. Let it be something new. That evening, as twilight softened the corners of the sky, Miles hammered the last board into place. The children painted signs: Beau's beans, Ruby's flowers, Caleb's corn, and Millie's mint patch. Elena added a final plaque, carved gently with her pocket knife. The garden that stayed. She held it for a moment before handing it to Miles. He knelt and nailed it to the new gate post with care. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was memory and intention. And this gate, this garden, it wasn't a boundary. It was an embrace. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Ruby curled with her sketchbook, Caleb drooling on his pillow, Beau reading by flashlight, and Millie whispering softly to her planted egg. Miles poured 2 mugs of tea and joined Elena on the porch swing. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the sighing wind, the creak of the fence gate, the occasional call of a night bird. You built that fence fast, Elena said softly. I've built a lot of things fast, Miles replied. Sometimes it was the only way I knew how to survive. She looked over at him. And now, he paused, then said, now, I'm learning how to build slow, with intention, with roots. Elena smiled, faintly turning the mug in her hands. I never thought I'd belong to a place again, she whispered. After Ellie died, I thought that part of me had gone with her. Miles looked at her, his gaze steady. Maybe it did. But that doesn't mean nothing else can grow. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a seed packet, lavender, faded, and wrinkled. This was in Ellie's coat pocket the day she passed, she said. I kept it. For years. Never opened it. Miles gently touched the corner of the packet reverently. Will you plant it? He asked. She hesitated. I think. I'd like to plant it with you. So they walked out together, under a sky full of quiet stars, past the fresh painted signs, and toward the center of the garden. Elena dug a small hole with her hands. Miles placed the seed. Together, they covered it. And for the first time, Elena didn't feel like she was burying a memory. She felt like she was letting it bloom. August crept in with the scent of dust and chamomile. The wind, once harsh and restless, now moved like a whisper across the tops of sunflower stalks that had grown almost as tall as Beau. Even the soil, after weeks of sun and sweat, had begun to soften its edges, cracking open just enough to let roots breathe. So had the people. By now, Elena's mornings followed a rhythm as steady as the rising sun. She woke before the birds tied back her hair-brewed strong coffee and prepared something warm, biscuits porridge, garden eggs with rosemary and sage. Miles had stopped rising before her, partly because she insisted, partly because her presence had folded itself into the structure of the home, like a support beam no one remembered building, but everyone now leaned on. She no longer felt like a guest. She felt needed, and not in a way that demanded gratitude, but in the quiet way a tree is needed to shade, to shelter, to steady the soil around it. That morning she stood with Ruby at the kitchen counter, teaching her how to braid pie crust. You pinch the edge here gently, Elena explained, her fingers moving like music. It's not about being perfect, just loving. Ruby furrowed her brow. It looks like a snail. Elena laughed. Then it's a beautiful snail. Outside the window, Caleb and Beau were hammering a crooked birdhouse together. Caleb talking too much, Beau saying nothing as usual. But something about the way Beau stood solid and present reminded Elena of Miles. Then came the sound of the screen door creaking open. Elena Millie stood barefoot, clutching a notepad. "Yes, sweetheart. Can I show you something?" Elena wiped her hands and knelt. Millie opened the notebook. Inside was a crayon drawing of a garden filled with flowers and strange floating hearts. At the center stood a girl with long hair and an apron holding the hands of 4 children. The title in Millie's careful, shaky handwriting read, "The Lady Who Came and Stayed." Elena blinked back tears. "It's beautiful." "It's you," Millie said plainly. "You didn't go away like Mama did." Elena hugged her close, inhaling the scent of sun and pencil shavings, and something fiercely alive. Meanwhile, Miles was in the shed out back, sanding down rough wood for a surprise he hadn't told anyone about. He worked in silence, no radio, no hammering rhythm, just the slow scrape of grit against grain. His hands, once strong and calloused from welding and repair work, had become gentler somehow. Not soft, just thoughtful. He was building a bench. Not just any bench, but one for the garden, the exact spot where Maggie had once rocked Millie to sleep under the lavender, where he had scattered some of her ashes on a windless day that broke him. He never thought he'd build something there again. But Elena had planted rosemary near that place, and one morning last week, Miles caught her singing quietly while she worked the soil, unaware he was watching. It wasn't Maggie's voice, but it didn't hurt to hear. In fact, it healed. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Miles found Elena on the porch, her tea beside her, her feet tucked under a worn quilt Ruby had insisted on airing out in the sun that morning. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She nodded without looking, scooting slightly. They sat in companionable quiet, the stars slowly kindling overhead like someone striking matches one by one. "I'm building something," he said finally. She glanced sideways. "A fence? No. A bench. For the garden." Elena's expression softened. "Where the lavender grows." He nodded. "I thought I couldn't touch that spot," he admitted. Felt like doing so would erase her. Elena let the silence hold that thought. "And now?" she asked gently. Now I think maybe she'd want someone else to sit there too. They didn't say anything for a while. Then Elena whispered, "Do you know what I miss the most?" Miles turned to her. "It's not Ellie's laugh, though I ache for it. It's not her hair or her hugs. It's—" She paused. "It's someone asking me how she liked her eggs. No one asks those questions when they know she's gone." Miles's voice was quiet, firm. How did she like her eggs? Elena looked down, her voice trembling into a smile. Scrambled, burnt a little on the edges, like tiny golden paper. Miles leaned back and let out a breath that felt like opening a window inside his chest. "You can tell me anything you know," he said. "I know," she whispered. Later that week, on a clear Thursday afternoon, Elena gathered the children in the garden and handed them paintbrushes and a small wooden sign. Together, they wrote, "The Garden That Remembered," dedicated to Maggie and Ellie, who taught us to plant even in sorrow. When Miles saw it, he said nothing, just wrapped his arms around all 4 of his children, and Elena at once, messy, awkward, full. And no one pulled away. It began with wind, not the gentle kind that rustled leaves or made the chimes on the porch sing softly through dusk, but a restless, agitated wind, the kind that rattled shutters and slammed gates like it had something to say. The afternoon had been sticky with heat, the air heavy, unmoving. By evening, thunder grumbled in the distance, the kind of summer storm that arrived not with fury, but with the slow, inevitable weight of something long held back. Inside the house, the energy felt off-kilter. Ruby was unusually moody, snapping at Caleb when he spilled juice on her sketchbook. Caleb, in turn, slammed a door. Beau, ever the observer, retreated to the loft with his book and refused to come down for dinner. Even Millie, usually the peacemaker, wandered listlessly between rooms, clutching her teddy bear like an anchor. Elena tried to keep the peace. She stirred a pot of tomato rice soup, baked cornbread, and lit the lantern early, hoping the warm glow would chase the restlessness away. But unease has a way of seeping through even the coziest walls. The storm hit just after nightfall. Lightning cracked across the sky as the first gust of wind blew open the half-latched porch door. The sudden bang startled Caleb, who knocked a ceramic mixing bowl off the counter in his scramble to see outside. It shattered on the floor. Not a loud crash, but enough. Enough to awaken a sound from Elena that the children had never heard. She didn't yell, but her voice, sharp, unfiltered, raw, cut through the room like broken glass. For heaven's sake, Caleb, why can't you just sit still for once? The boy froze. His lower lip trembled. Ruby gasped softly. Elena's chest rose and fell quickly. She stared at the broken bowl like it had betrayed her. Her hands trembled. Fists clenched tight. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out the back door into the rain. Miles found her 10 minutes later behind the shed, kneeling in the mud, hands covered in wet earth, digging into a patch of ground that had no business being touched in the middle of a storm. Elena, he called gently, his voice strained by the wind. She didn't turn. He walked closer, crouching beside her. "You're bleeding," he said, noticing a jagged cut across her palm. She hadn't even noticed. She stared at the hole she'd dug. It was just a bowl. Miles said nothing. "It wasn't about Caleb," she continued, voice shaking. "It was about me." He waited. She sat back on her heels, rain soaking her through. "The last time I yelled like that was with Ellie. Over something stupid. A spilled drink," she cried. And the next morning she had a fever. By the time I got her to the hospital, it was already too late. "Elena." "I know it wasn't my fault," she interrupted. "I know that. But knowing and believing, they're not the same." Miles reached for her hand. She didn't pull away this time. "You've been carrying that moment like it defines you," he said quietly. She nodded. "But it doesn't." He paused. "Elena, do you know what I saw tonight? A woman who cares so deeply she breaks when she thinks she's failed a child, even for a second. That's not weakness. That's love." She looked at him, eyes brimming. "I've been so afraid that if I let myself love again, I'd lose everything all over." Miles nodded, understanding in his bones. "I was the same. After Maggie, I stopped laughing, stopped building, stopped hoping. Because hoping meant risking more hurt." She swallowed hard. "Then why did you let me in?" "Because one day," he said, voice hoarse, "I saw Millie smile again, and I realized the cost of never loving again was higher than the risk of losing." He pulled her into his arms, mud and rain be damned. And for a long time neither of them said anything. They just sat there under the storm, letting it pass through them. Later that night, Elena returned to the house in dry clothes, her hair braided loosely down her back. The children had gone to bed, but Caleb had left her a note on the table. "I'm sorry I broke the bowl. I love you even when you're mad. Caleb." Elena pressed it to her chest and cried softly. The next morning she made pancakes with extra cinnamon and kissed each child on the forehead without a word. Caleb beamed. Ruby slipped a flower into her braid. Bo, silent as ever, handed her a repaired version of the bowl clumsily glued together. Millie climbed into her lap and whispered, "Even broken things can be pretty." Elena nodded, holding her tightly. "Yes, my love, especially broken things." The morning light in early September had a softness to it, like a quilt freshly pulled from a cedar chest. The garden, once lifeless and weary, now breathed with vibrant color. Lavender bloomed in gentle waves near the fence. Fat tomatoes drooped from their vines. The corn planted haphazardly by Caleb and Bo had somehow reached shoulder height and was beginning to silk. And the bench. The new bench sat beneath the old apple tree, where Maggie once read stories in the golden light of evening. Now it bore a fresh coat of oil and a small carved inscription at the back, for the ones we loved. For the ones we still can. Elena stood on the porch with a small basket hooked over one arm. She looked at the garden, not with the hope of what it might become, but with the quiet pride of what they had made. This was no longer Maggie's garden, no longer Elena's refuge, no longer just a corner of earth behind a grieving house. It was theirs. "Harvest tonight," Miles said, stepping onto the porch with his tool belt slung low on his hip. He looked younger lately, though nothing about his face had changed. It was something in the way he stood. More open, less guarded. "The kids are already asking if there will be pie." Elena smiled. "There better be. Ruby said she's been training for this moment all week." They both laughed. It was easy now, natural. Laughter was no longer a stranger in this home. All afternoon, the children moved like sunlight through the garden. Ruby clipped flowers for the table. Bo carefully carried baskets of squash and beans. Caleb managed to fall into a pile of turnips twice, but bounced up laughing. And Millie, with unmatched seriousness, picked sprigs of rosemary and whispered to them before placing them gently into the woven bowl. "Why do you do that?" Elena asked softly. Millie looked up. "So they know they're going somewhere nice." Elena touched the girl's cheek. "Then they'll be very happy." At sunset, Miles and Bo brought out a long wooden table, one Miles had built years ago, but never used outside. They set it under the apple tree. Ruby and Elena laid a cotton cloth across the top, weighed down by jars of marigolds and tiny pumpkins. Dinner was simple but perfect. A roasted vegetable tart, tomato soup with basil, buttermilk biscuits, a berry cobbler made from what little they had foraged that morning. They sat together, 5 chairs filled by 5 voices, and 2 more seats left purposefully open at the far end of the table. Elena didn't ask. Miles didn't explain. But everyone knew. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit, Ruby stood with her sketchbook and cleared her throat. "I made something," she said, her voice wavering but steady. She opened to a page filled with small watercolor portraits, Maggie in her gardening hat, Ellie with a lavender sprig behind one ear, the house, the garden, the table. I wanted them to be here too. Silence fell. Then Miles reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "They are." Elena stepped away for a moment and returned with a small wooden box. She opened it slowly and revealed the lavender seeds from Ellie's coat pocket. "I've saved these for a long time," she said, voice soft. "But tonight feels right." She offered them to Millie. "Would you like to help me plant them?" "Right here under the tree," Millie nodded solemnly. The two walked to the base of the apple tree, knelt together, and made a small hollow in the earth. Elena tipped the seeds into Millie's hand. They planted them side by side, mother and child, past and present. As they stood, Millie whispered, "Now they'll grow forever." After dessert, as the stars peeked through the fabric of the sky, Miles took out his old guitar, an object not heard in the house since Maggie died. He tuned it slowly, then played a simple tune, warm, slow, familiar. Elena recognized the melody. So did the children. It was the lullaby from the music box that had sat unused on Millie's shelf for 3 years. The girl stood and walked toward Miles, crawling into his lap. "You remembered," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "I never forgot. They all stayed out later than they should have. No one wanted to be the first to leave the magic." Eventually, Elena rose and gathered the empty bowls. As she turned back toward the house, Miles touched her arm. "Elena." She stopped. "I never imagined someone would fill this house again. But you didn't just fill it. You gave it roots." Elena's eyes welled. "I didn't know I had anything left to give." "You did," he said gently. "And you gave it to us." That night, as she lay in bed with the window open and the scent of earth drifting in, Elena whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. Not for something, but in gratitude. Outside, the wind rustled the lavender leaves and carried her words into the dark like a promise. Autumn came slowly that year, not in great gusts or sudden frosts, but in quiet transformations, leaves shifting from green to gold. Without warning, the sun lingering lower in the sky, the wind carrying the scent of apples and turned earth. The children traded sandals for boots. The mornings began with scarves. And the lavender. Elena and Millie's lavender grew just tall enough to brush against the hem of Maggie's old apron as it fluttered on the clothesline. One morning, Elena stood at the kitchen sink drying the last of the breakfast plates when she noticed something on the windowsill. A folded note tucked between the jar of basil and the old salt shaker. It was from Beau in his familiar tidy script. "Miss Elena, I don't say a lot, but I watch a lot, and I've seen how happy Dad is now. I've seen how Millie hums again. I even heard Ruby sing in the garden. That's because of you. I just wanted you to know that if you stayed forever, that'd be okay with me." Beau Elena pressed the note to her chest, and for a long moment she simply stood there, eyes closed, tears warm and unhurried. She didn't need grand gestures. Just truth quietly offered. That afternoon, Miles called everyone to the back fence. He was holding a bundle wrapped in brown paper. When he unwrapped it, Elena gasped softly. A carved wooden sign. Simple. Handcrafted. Weathered just enough. "Welcome to Thatcher and Marin Garden where things grow again." The children clapped. Caleb whooped. Ruby insisted on painting flowers around the border. Elena looked at Miles, unsure if she should speak, but she didn't have to. His eyes were full of the answer. The next week, Miles and Elena drove into town together for supplies. It was the first time they'd left the house alone, just the two of them. They didn't talk much in the truck. They didn't need to. Miles had a hand on the gear shift. Elena laid her fingers over it and left them there the entire way. At the hardware store, someone called Elena by name. It was Mrs. Grant, the same woman who had whispered rumors weeks ago. "I heard you're still at the Thatcher place," she said, not unkindly but surprised. "I am," Elena replied, meeting her gaze. "And I plan to be." Mrs. Grant nodded slowly. "Good. That place needed a woman's touch again." Elena smiled. "Turns out I did too." That Sunday, Miles prepared the bench under the apple tree with fresh cushions. He brought out 2 mugs of cider and waited. Elena came with a small box, her grandmother's old photo album Ellie's blanket folded neatly on top. They sat in silence for a while, the late sun warm on their shoulders. "I used to think life had a finish line," Miles said. "Like once you lost what mattered most, that was it. Just coasting after that." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. And now he took a long breath. "Now I think maybe love isn't a line. Maybe it's a circle. It goes quiet, then comes back in different shapes." She opened the album and placed it on his lap. "Then, let's keep it going." That night, as stars blinked awake across the deep blue sky, the family gathered for a final evening in the garden before the first frost. They brought blankets and cocoa and 1 lantern to hang from the apple tree. Millie curled beside Elena on the bench. "Will the garden sleep now?" she asked. "Yes," Elena answered. "But sleep isn't the end. It's just rest. And when spring comes, it will remember." Millie nodded. Will you remember, too? Elena kissed her forehead. Always. Inside, as the house quieted, Miles and Elena stood at the back door, looking out across the dark silhouette of the garden. The wind brushed past them, not sharp, not cold, just cool enough to remind them of time. Do you ever think about what's next? She asked. I used to avoid it, Miles said. Now I think about what's now and let the rest catch up. She reached for his hand. He took it and brought it to his lips. I love you, Miles. The words came out like breath. Natural. Unforced. He looked at her eyes glassy. I know he said. And I love you too. No firework. No orchestra. Just a quiet truth planted deep. And outside, beneath the cooling stars, the garden behind the house slept peacefully, full of seeds, stories, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share a little piece of your corner of the world with us. It's always a joy to see how far kindness can travel. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, quiet healing and full of second chances, feel free to subscribe and join our little storytelling family. No pressure, just a gentle welcome whenever you're ready. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. We hope this story stayed with you, just like the garden behind the house, quietly growing even after the last word.